586 BC, the heavy dead thud of Babylonian battering rams shatters the stone walls of Jerusalem. The city is a cauldron of fire, blood, and sheer chaos. The king flees blindly into the night. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar's shock troops march forward with one single target in mind, the most valuable, most deadly object in the ancient world, the Ark of the Covenant. The orders were clear: sack Solomon's temple, take Israel's ultimate weapon as a trophy. But when the soldiers finally smash through the doors of the Holy of Holies and slash the sacred veil, they come face to face with absolutely nothing. No divine light, no wrath from the heavens, just dust dancing in the air and an empty room. The most feared artifact on earth has simply vanished off the map. The answer to this brutal disappearance has nothing to do with movie magic or cheap treasure hunter legends. What actually went down in those final hours was the largest, fastest, and deadliest extraction operation in ancient history. How do you wipe a heavy, solid gold chest from a besieged city, right under the noses of the invaders and the people themselves? For decades, the legend of the Ark of the Covenant has been hijacked by Hollywood scripts and modern-day treasure hunters. They've turned it into a mere action movie prop, a golden magic box waiting to be found by knockoff heroes. Forget the cinematic illusions. The real answer to its absolute disappearance isn't hidden behind booby traps and cursed temples. It's rooted in the cold, desperate, and brutally tactical reality of the Babylonian siege. In the ancient world, when a city realized its walls were about to cave to enemy forces, the clergy's first and most urgent priority was simple: hide the sacred. Shield the relics from the inevitable looting. It was survival rule number one in ancient warfare. The big problem, the logistical nightmare for the Jewish priests in those final hours, was that the Ark of the Covenant was far from just a gold-lined chest. To the Israelites, and to any army that crossed its path, it functioned as a highly unstable, intensely lethal weapon of war. You don't just grab the Ark of the Covenant, throw it on some soldier's back, and make a run for the back door. The historical and biblical narrative is unforgiving when reminding us exactly what happened to anyone who dared underestimate its lethality. Remember the tragic story of Uzzah? The man who, with the best of intentions, reached out to steady the ark so it wouldn't fall off a cart, and was struck dead on the spot. Moving this piece required a level of caution that bordered on military paranoia. It was strictly mandatory to follow extreme security protocols. They had to use specific carrying poles made of untouchable wood. They could only deploy rigorously purified Levites, and they had to accept an incredibly high risk of sudden death if someone so much as tripped in the dark. Now, just try to imagine the sheer tension of executing this millimeter-perfect transport in the middle of a city gripped by total panic. Civilians are starving to death in narrow alleyways, and the deafening roar of battering rams is crushing the last lines of defense. What ancient documents reveal to us now is the surgical anatomy of this inexplicable disappearance. It's a deep dive into the chaos faced by veteran priests who, watching the fires consume the edges of Jerusalem, came to a terrifying realization. The definitive end had arrived. The military perimeter was breached, and divine intervention wasn't coming down from the clouds to wipe out the enemy troops. The only viable way out was to wipe the most dangerous artifact on earth right off Emperor Nebuchadnezzar's tactical map. It was an exhausting race against the clock. The slightest technical failure would mean the greatest spiritual humiliation ever forced upon Israel. Watching the mercy seat, the earthly throne of God Himself, dragged into Babylonian public squares as a cheap, profane trophy. Before we step down into those besieged streets, a quick, honest invitation. If you value raw, unvarnished history, far from cheap sensationalism, hit that like button and subscribe. And if this rescue mission moved you in any way, drop a simple Amen in the comments. In such superficial times, that small gesture carries massive weight. It's our genuine way of knowing we aren't walking this path alone. Now, lock in your focus. The Great Wall has just caved. The smoke is rising to the heavens, and all hell has broken loose. To understand the level of despair that took over the temple in those final hours, you need to smell the smoke and the death hanging over Jerusalem. We aren't talking about an open field battle where armies clash and tactical retreat is on the table. We are talking about a brutal, methodical, and suffocating siege. Imagine the claustrophobia of an entire city locked inside its own walls, while the most ruthless war machine of the ancient world sets up camp in your backyard. The Babylonian engineers were in no rush whatsoever. Nebuchadnezzar's military tactic was to strangle Jerusalem until the city choked on its own blood and collapsed to its knees. Starvation swept through the cobblestone alleys with a ferocity that ancient records describe in stomach-churning detail. The Book of Lamentations doesn't mince words when recording the unthinkable. Desperation reached a point where people lost their last shred of humanity. Mothers were driven to unspeakable acts just to survive one more day. It was rock bottom for human dignity. Jewish soldiers, once proud of their warrior bloodline, were now deserts in the dead of night. They jumped the walls in a useless hope of finding mercy, only to be executed by Chaldean patrols down below. And in the middle of this apocalyptic nightmare, one man's voice rang out like a death knell: Jeremiah, the prophet nobody in the royal court wanted to listen to, but who deep down everyone knew was right. For years, he warned them that defeat was a past due bill. There would be no last-minute miracle, no angels drawing swords to slice through the invading army. The game was over, and it was time to pay up. It was exactly this brutal realization that flipped the switch inside the temple complex. The high priests looked out over the defenses, saw the horizon blanketed with enemy tents, and accepted the cold, hard reality. God wasn't going to step in to save the stones of this city. The clergy's official mission changed drastically in the snap of a finger. This was no longer the time for beautiful hymns and ritual sacrifices. The job of the Levite bloodline went from worship straight to maximum emergency damage control. The religious authorities' main concern wasn't the gold on the doors or the fine tapestries on the altar. It was the Ark of the Covenant. To the military and spiritual mindset of the time, capturing a defeated nation's central relic was bulletproof evidence that the victorious God had definitively crushed the loser. The Babylonians were already dreaming of dragging the ark away and showing it off as an exotic, unholy trophy in the temple of the god Marduk back in Babylon. For the Israelite priests, the mere thought of a pagan soldier's blood-stained hands touching the cherubim on the mercy seat was the absolute annihilation of Israel's very essence. It was a fate far worse than physical death. It was strictly unacceptable. In that exact sliver of time, under the heavy, constant pounding of catapults fracturing the city's defenses, the most drastic and highly classified decision in biblical history was made. The ultimate concealment protocol goes into effect. Men who had dedicated their entire lives to meticulous rituals now had to get their robes dirty with dust and sweat to engineer an impossible extraction. They had to pull it off without sparking even more mass hysteria, without tipping off enemy spies infiltrating the city, and above all, without making a single human error while handling the deadliest weapon on earth. The clock was bleeding out. The walls groaned from sheer exhaustion. But inside the pitch-black shadows of the Holy of Holies, the long, untouchable wooden poles were already sliding silently through the rings of pure gold. The massive flaw of anyone trying to unravel the Ark's disappearance is assuming it was all just a desperate last-minute improvisation. A bunch of priests running around like chickens with their heads cut off while the city burned. The truth? The definitive clue to how this operation went down isn't found in the final days of the siege. It's actually hiding in plain sight in the official records of the Bible itself, decades before the first Babylonian boot ever stepped foot in Jerusalem. To piece this puzzle together, we need to take a quick step back and look at the reign of King Josiah. Right there, in the texts of 2 Chronicles, we find a direct, somewhat curious order from the monarch to the elite clergy. Put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, did build. It shall not be a burden upon your shoulders. If you read that with the eyes of a military strategist, the question hits you dead center. Why would the king need to order the ark to be placed back inside the temple? There is only one logical, undeniable answer. It wasn't there. Years before Josiah took the crown, Jerusalem had spiraled into a dark hole under the command of idolatrous and tyrannical kings, Manasseh being the absolute worst of them. The desecration reached such an absurd level that pagan altars were erected right in the temple courtyard. Faced with this intolerable outrage, the most loyal priests realized the environment was completely compromised. The ark was in real danger of being violated by cults that had seized power in Judah. The solution they found? A tactical retreat. The nation's ultimate relic was secretly ripped from the Holy of Holies, stashed away in highly trusted civilian cellars or camouflaged in isolated caves on the outskirts of the city, just waiting for the dust to settle. This prior movement is the golden detail that completely flips our perspective on the fateful year of 586 BC. Josiah's order proves, with documentary evidence, that the Levites already knew exactly how to sneak the artifact out of the temple. The clergy wasn't just a bunch of old men burning incense. They had an actual shadow ops division. They already had escape routes mapped out down to the inch. They knew the exact width of the corridors to maneuver the heavy poles. They knew exactly how many steps to take in pitch-black darkness. And they had safe houses that had already been extensively stress-tested against Judah's own corrupt kings. The logistics of invisibility weren't theoretical. They had already been proven in the field, and it's exactly this level of detail that gets lost when we read the scriptures in fragments. If you enjoy connecting the historical dots just like we're doing right now, I want to invite you to check out my ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order. In it, we take the entire narrative from Genesis to Revelation and reorganize it into one massive timeline. It lets you see the precise context of every king, every prophet, and every empire with absolute clarity. The link to grab this material is in the first pinned comment. Back to the final siege. When the Babylonian war machine tightened the tourniquet and pure terror flooded the streets, the high command didn't need to invent some crazy new scheme. They simply activated that old contingency protocol. The plan now was surgical: snatch the ark out of Nebuchadnezzar's sight without triggering panic among the starving population. Trying to march out the main gates with a massive chest of gold would be signing a death warrant. If they couldn't escape above ground, the only alternative was to look down. The true route to wiping the Ark of the Covenant off the map didn't call for fast wagons. It demanded iron lungs, burning torches, and a straight dive into absolute darkness. The climax of the tension wouldn't happen on the walls. It would happen deep underground. If you glance at the tactical map of the Babylonian siege, you'll quickly realize that any attempt to escape on the surface was pure delusion. Nebuchadnezzar was no amateur general. He had choked off every single millimeter of the escape routes. Trying to smuggle the Ark of the Covenant through the open Judean desert with the blazing sun bouncing off that solid gold would be like setting off a flare in the dead of night. Chaldean patrols would have intercepted the convoy before they even crossed the Kidron Valley. The surface was a total loss, and the gates were already buckling under the methodical pounding of the battering rams. For the Levite team tasked with protecting the artifact, the math of survival boiled down to one single geometric direction: down. They had to swallow their pride, turn their backs to the sunlight, and sink the ark into the freezing bowels of the earth. Here's a geographic detail that most people completely ignore. Jerusalem isn't just a stone fortress built on hills. Underneath, it's a literal Swiss cheese. The city's underground, especially beneath the foundations of Mount Moriah, is a colossal labyrinth. Giant natural caves, aqueducts carved into solid rock, empty cisterns, and deep quarries, like the famous Zedekiah's Cave, form a subterranean complex with dozens of tunnels branching out like dark veins right under the invaders' noses. The priests knew this topography with their eyes closed. After all, the massive stones used to build Solomon's temple were quarried directly from there. That was the ultimate safe house, an impenetrable vault far out of reach from enemy catapults, a shadowy ecosystem where Babylonian fury simply had no jurisdiction. Now, picture this scene as the sheer weight of reality sends a chill down your spine. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't some charming little jewelry box. It was a dense piece of acacia wood furniture, completely plated in gold, topped with a massive lid and two heavy cherubim. The weight of the whole setup demanded brute strength and flawless synchronization. The elite tactical team holds their breath and lifts the long poles. Cold sweat drips down their faces, driven not just by the Herculean effort of carrying that tonnage, but by pure, unadulterated terror. One false step, one boot slipping on wet stone, a millimeter of imbalance on the lid, and the artifact's lethality would instantly collect its toll. Nobody down there wanted to repeat Uzzah's tragic end. Moving the ark in broad daylight was already walking on a razor's edge. Doing it in the pitch-black darkness of a cave was flirting directly with annihilation. The descent begins, and the tension cuts the throat like a blade. They leave the smooth, leveled floor of the temple and enter the jagged underground passages. Every step on the damp rock demands almost superhuman focus. The only light comes from flickering torches casting massive, nervous shadows against the cave walls. As they sink deeper into the dark, the city above them is, quite literally, falling apart. They hear the muffled thuds of the invasion, the screams bleeding through the cracks in the stone, the unmistakable crash of masonry collapsing into the sacred courtyard. The dust from the explosions on the surface drifts relentlessly down the ventilation shafts, mixing with the heavy smell of mold. It is a wildly claustrophobic operation. There's no room for poetic heroism here, only the ragged breathing of the priests, the burning of failing muscles, and the groaning of wood bearing an impossible load. The deeper they descended into the stone labyrinth, the more the apocalypse of Jerusalem became just a distant echo. They were marching straight toward the voluntary tomb of the most sacred piece of Israel's history. Navigating those tight shafts without tilting the ark, balancing tons of physical and psychological pressure, is unquestionably the pinnacle of ancient priestly logistics. Arriving at a deep chamber right in the world's blind spot, the ark was finally set down. The site was sealed with raw stone and rubble, surgically camouflaged to look like nothing more than the cave's natural rock. No tracks left behind, no map. While Babylonian troops pillaged the surface with absolute hatred, fully believing they had crushed the soul of Judah, the undeniable truth was that the Levites had already buried the artifact in unbreakable silence, safe in a place where Nebuchadnezzar's claws would never be able to scratch it. When the massive bronze hinges finally gave way under the axe blows, and Nebuchadnezzar's shocked troops stormed the inner complex of Solomon's temple, they expected the ultimate climax. Those soldiers, caked in blood and soot, had suffered through months of hell in that siege, kept alive by the promise of looting the final treasure. In the mind of an ancient general, the ultimate prize wasn't just melting gold to mint coins. It was breaking the enemy's psychological spine. Capturing the Ark of the Covenant meant dragging the very heart of Israel through the streets of Babylon, dropping it right at the feet of the god Marduk. Checkmate. But when they breached the Holy of Holies and ripped down the sacred veil with their blades, they didn't find glory. They got a brutal reality check. The room was completely stripped. The artifact was gone. The ark was already rooted deep in the bedrock, dozens of feet below ground, long before the first Chaldean boot ever stained the courtyard with blood. If you suspect this sudden anticlimax is just a cheap script writing trick to force some drama, I invite you to analyze the historical documents with the cold calculation of a forensics expert. The account we find in the second book of Kings, chapter 25, is far from an epic tale. It's written with the dryness of a police report. It's a bureaucratic, cold, and calculated inventory. And it's exactly in this ancient paperwork that the proof of the empty room hits you right in the face. With almost sickening obsession, the text lists every single item Babylon scraped out of the temple. They logged the theft of the bronze pillars, the cauldrons, the ash shovels, the wick trimmers, the spoons, and the censers. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the imperial guard, made it a point to record the confiscation of forks and bowls. Stop for a second and look at the military humiliation hiding between those lines. The most feared war machine on the planet kicks in the door of the most legendary temple in the Middle East, And what do they present as the grand spoil of war to their emperor? A batch of pots, dustpans, and luxury silverware. Leaving the Ark off that seizure list wasn't an oversight. It is the definitive proof of the siege's tactical failure. In no ancient military chronicle does an army hide the fact that they captured their enemy's deity or central relic. If Babylon had laid so much as a finger on the Ark of the Covenant, Nebuchadnezzar would have had that triumph carved into every single brick of his capital. It would have been the greatest political propaganda campaign of the century. The deafening silence of the official records screams the truth. They didn't take it because they couldn't find it. The frustration and rage of the invading troops must have gone off the charts in that moment. The vault was cracked, but the grand prize had already evaporated. To avoid going back empty-handed and facing total embarrassment in the final report, they smashed the solid bronze of the pillars and scraped up whatever was left. They likely brutally interrogated and tortured the low-ranking priests left behind in a desperate bid to beat the gold's location out of them. But practically speaking, the sacking of Solomon's temple was the invasion of an empty shell. The Jewish high clergy managed to pull off a historical sleight of hand against the greatest empire of their time. It was a shadow intelligence operation so flawless that the Babylonian army burned the entire city to the ground without ever realizing the heart of Jerusalem was beating untouched right beneath their boots. And here we hit the big question, the one that inevitably racks the brain of anyone with an ounce of logical, critical thinking. If the Ark of the Covenant was just hidden underground by the Jewish priests themselves, why didn't they just go down there with pickaxes and haul the box back up 70 years later, when the Persian Empire allowed the exiles to return and rebuild the temple? It seems like an obvious deduction, right? The problem is that ancient military history doesn't play out like an adventure movie, where the treasure map is conveniently tucked inside a bottle for the next generation. The answer to the artifact's definitive disappearance is brutally surgical. There was a total, irreversible breakdown in intelligence. To understand how this went down, you have to analyze the High Command's protocol in those final hours. That underground extraction operation wasn't broadcasted to the masses to calm down the population. This was a maximum-level state secret, highly compartmentalized. In all likelihood, only the high priest and a tiny tactical team of elite Levites knew the exact route through the stone maze, the correct chamber, and how to disarm the rock camouflage. They were the exclusive gatekeepers of the mental map. The security plan was genuinely flawless, but it came with one lethal catch. It completely relied on these men surviving the war to pass the information along. But that's exactly where Babylon's bloodbath stepped into the frame, destroying any chance of recovery. When the walls caved and the shock troops swept through the capital, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't satisfied with just looting gold and setting houses on fire. He deployed a ruthless tactic of domination, the total decapitation of local leadership. The goal was to rip the brain right out of the Jewish nation, ensuring they would never again have the strength or cohesion to rebel. The Book of Kings is cold, direct, and terrifying when recording the fate of the temple's top brass. Commander Nebuzaradan captured Sariah, the acting high priest, along with the second priest and the complex's elite guard. These men, the exact minds who engineered the burial of the Ark, weren't spared, nor were they taken into captivity as VIP prisoners. They were dragged to Nebuchadnezzar's headquarters in the city of Riblah, where they were summarily executed in cold blood. The few members of the inner clergy who didn't get their throats slit on the streets of Jerusalem or executed in military tribunals were slapped in chains and forced into exhausting death marches through the desert toward Babylon. That select handful of men holding the vital intelligence regarding the ark's exact location was wiped off the tactical map in a matter of days. The secret wasn't passed down because, amidst the bloodbath and total panic, there simply was no time to train a successor or sketch routes on a piece of parchment. Judah's strategic intelligence was effectively erased by the swing of a Chaldean sword. That is exactly why, decades later, when the Jews returned with clearance to rebuild the temple, the Holy of Holies had to be reconstructed and kept completely empty. The new generation of priests had the gold, they had the political willpower, and they mastered the architecture, but they didn't have the slightest clue where to dig in that Swiss cheese of tunnels beneath Mount Moriah. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't destroyed or melted down by pagan enemies. It was literally buried alive under the very city it was supposed to protect. The hideout they designed was so technically brilliant that it became a life sentence. The map to history's most coveted treasure wasn't lost to time, and it isn't waiting for adventurers. It bled out and died in the slashed throats of the high priests, sealing the ancient world's most absolute mystery in the pitch-black underground of Jerusalem. The mystery of the disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant, therefore, is a far cry from a tale of magic, a mystical legend, or an easy adventure plot to be solved with a dusty scroll. When we strip the narrative of all its sensationalism and stare straight into the cold, hard, tactical facts, what we're left with is the result of the most successful and simultaneously the most tragic intelligence and security operation in biblical history. Crushed under the weight of the greatest army of antiquity, surrounded by the rhythmic pounding of battering rams and screams of absolute despair, the priests of Israel achieved the unthinkable. They managed to shield the sacred mercy seat, the non-negotiable epicenter of their faith and identity, from Babylonian humiliation and desecration. But this tactical victory demanded a brutal toll. The price paid for this absolute protection was total and irreversible amnesia. The Ark was silently swallowed by the bowels of the very city it was built to protect, sealed away in a vault of solid rock where it would never see the light of day again. When the fog of war finally settled, when the blood dried on the cobblestones and decades consumed the exile, a new scenario took shape. The proud Babylonian Empire crumbled. The Second Temple was meticulously rebuilt in Jerusalem with Persian backing. New walls were raised, and a new sacred veil was hung in its place of honor. Yet there was a phantom weight that would haunt that structure until its ultimate demise. The Holy of Holies remained absolutely empty. There were no massive cherubim, no acacia wood ark, no earthly throne for the divine. This architectural void echoed for centuries. Entire generations of high priests walked into a completely bare room once a year on the Day of Atonement, filled with nothing but incense smoke and the deafening silence of an irreparable absence. It is exactly this massive empty space that testifies to the final, undeniable truth about the fall of Jerusalem. The greatest triumph of that day of fire and horror in 586 BC did not belong to Nebuchadnezzar, nor to his bronze-medaled generals who set the gates ablaze. The true, secret, and eternal military victory of that day belonged exclusively to those anonymous Levites, the men who turned their backs to the sky, descended into absolute darkness, bore the crushing physical weight of their own faith, and ensured, at the cost of their own blood and their own slashed throats, that the sacred core of Israel was wiped off the face of the earth forever.